we have been in being as a party for longer than any other democratic party in Western Europe. We've won more elections. We've lost a few on the route. But we've won more elections, and we have perhaps served in government longer, more often, and better in the interests of our country than any other democratic. And we will do so again.
Exchquer, Mr. Exchquer, please, sir. Mr. Exchquer, Chancellor Philip Hammond.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question together with question number 8. Since 2010, HMRC has secured over £175 billion that would have gone unpaid, and has introduced over 100 new measures to crack down on tax avoidance, evasion and other forms of non-compliance, so that the tax gap is now at a record low and one of the lowest in the world at 6%.
Exchquer. I'm grateful for that response, and it's extremely encouraging that the UK tax gap is at a record low. But when we have a situation where it appears that multinationals are trying to run rings around HMRC, can my right honourable friend outline what further steps the government is now taking to build on this excellent success?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for bringing this issue up, and it is a great achievement to have got the tax gap to one of the lowest in the world. But we're not complacent. We're currently conducting a call for evidence on whether online platforms should play a greater role in ensuring tax compliance by their users. We're consulting on an innovative split payment method in tackling online VAT fraud, and we will continue to lead in the G20 and other fora on seeking agreed multilateral solutions to the challenge of where and how to tax global digital companies, which are particularly difficult to tax under the current system.
Mr. Nigel Mills.
Can I echo the praise for the HMRC's performance over recent years in tackling this? Is the Chancellor becoming more convinced of the importance of having a public country-by-country reporting, so not only HMRC can see where multinationals are making their profit, but customers can and campaigners can, so we can make sure they're paying the right tax in the right countries?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. As he will know, the UK was one of the first countries to implement the OECD model for country-by-country reporting on to tax authorities. Those reports have been required for periods starting on or after 1st of January 2016. On the question of public reporting, the government is committed to a multilateral approach to ensure that reporting provides comprehensive information and is fair between UK headquartered and non-UK headquartered multinationals. And we're engaging constructively on the EU proposals for public country-by-country reporting, which we see as a step in the right direction.
Sir Vincent Cable.
The Chancellor will be aware of President Macron's proposal for taxing the revenue of the big internet platforms, which he acknowledges are very difficult to tax under existing rules. Building on the entente cordiale of recent days, is the government considering cooperating with and learning from the French model as to how we should do this?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call it a French model. It's a Franco-German initiative, and we have been working very closely with the French and the Germans on this. We've discussed it at the G20 in Buenos Aires a couple of weeks ago. We'll be discussing it again at the informal ECOFIN meeting in Sofia at the end of next week. And the government's position is that we are supportive of the EU proposals, but we do want to be clear that any such measure can only be a temporary solution. The long-term solution has to be an agreed multilateral approach to the taxation of the digital economy. That requires us to get the United States on side, because most of these global digital companies are domiciled in the United States, and without the cooperation and support of the United States, it would be very difficult to make any tax system sustainable.
Neil Gray.
Mr. Speaker, it's critical that HMRC collects tax correctly. And to that end, could I ask the Ministers when I'm likely to receive a reply to my letter the 6th of February regarding the Roadchef case, where HMRC is still to settle with Roadchef EBT over money paid to HMRC as tax in error?
Well, my honourable friend, the Financial Secretary, tells me, Mr. Speaker, that he's agreed to meet with the honourable gentleman, but hasn't actually heard from the honourable gentleman to arrange a meeting. But let me reiterate on my honourable friend's behalf that he would be happy to meet with the honourable gentleman on this case.
Young Philp was standing a moment ago. Eh? The fellow stopped standing. Do you want to get in there, man? Go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was very. I could hardly resist such encouragement. It was really only to say how much I welcome the government's recent paper, which the Financial Secretary published. Well, there's a serious point here. There is a serious point on corporate tax in the digital economy, which demonstrated once again this country is showing leadership. And I do encourage the Treasury to look at working with the European Union on this sales tax and even consider a user tax if we can do that more quickly.
Excellent. Thank you. The honourable gentleman's job application is in the post. Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your very carefully tailored piece of demand stimulation there. It was much appreciated for the economy of the Chamber. My honourable friend is right. As I've already said, working with the EU on this interim proposal for a turnover-based tax, the government thinks is the right thing to do. We have, of course, also introduced an interim measure of our own, seeking to tax licence fees which are paid to low-tax jurisdictions where we judge that the underlying basis of the licence fee is economic activity taking place in the UK. So we have that measure already in place, and we will continue to work with the EU on its proposed measure.
Thank you. Annalisa Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite promising to tighten up on Scottish limited partnerships, not a single non-compliant SLP appears to have been fined, which could have raised up to £2.2 billion. When will SLPs be banned? And what action is the government taking on other shell companies to stop tax fiddling and money laundering? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady asks a specific detailed question about Scottish limited partnerships. The legislation is designed to deter the kind of activity that she's referring to. The absence of fines shouldn't be taken as an indication of the absence of activity. As she will know, HMRC always seeks, first of all, to deter non-compliant behaviour before it moves into hard compliance. But if I may, Mr. Speaker, I'll write to the honourable lady with a more detailed answer on the very specific point about Scottish limited partnerships.
Mr. Speaker, to follow up on that question about Scottish limited partnerships, I'm concerned that the Chancellor is not able to stand up and talk about tangible action that he's taking around this. This has been a live issue for a very long period of time. Can the Chancellor commit to actually taking action on Scottish limited partnerships?
Well, what I can commit to the House is this. Wherever HMRC detects non-compliant behaviour, it will act, but it is for HMRC to determine how best to act in individual cases, and it's right that ministers do not have direct involvement in HMRC pursuing individual cases. But I will write to the honourable lady, the opposition spokesman, and I'm sure that the honourable lady will be interested in that reply.
Mr. Speaker, there were 2,800 Scottish limited partnerships registered last year. Only 1,100 of those have registered persons of significant control. That is a very low percentage. Of those 1,100, 172 of them are registered as belonging to Russian individuals. Mr. Speaker, given all that is happening just now, it is absolutely vital that the Chancellor takes urgent action on this, not just a letter at some point in the future. This needs to happen as soon as possible.
Well, I'll ensure that the honourable lady gets the letter as soon as possible, Mr. Speaker. But I mean, it's right to focus on groups that are using structures for non-compliance or purposes that we would wish to deter, and HMRC will always continue to do so. But I will update the honourable lady by letter, hopefully later today.
Mr. Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 2.
Secretary Mills Stride.
Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his question. The government is bearing down tirelessly on the tax burden on businesses of all sizes reducing corporation tax from 28% for large companies in 2010 to 19% today, and for small businesses from 21% to 19%. And we will go still further, reducing the burden to 17% by 2020. And for unincorporated businesses, Mr. Speaker, we are of course increasing the personal allowance in the last budget to £11,850. That will increase further to £12,500 in 2010, further relief to many small businesses.
Lawrence Robertson.
I thank the Minister for that encouraging answer. Businesses are, of course, unpaid tax collectors for the Exchequer, and the Federation of Small Businesses recently estimated that businesses spend on average 3 working weeks a year on tax compliance. So is there anything further the Minister can do to reduce that kind of expensive burden on businesses?
I thank my honourable friend for raising the FSB's report. I have not only read it, Mr. Speaker, but I have met with the FSB to discuss the report in detail, and I would highlight to the House 2 of their important recommendations. One is around better guidance on taxation, and I have tasked officials on that mission within HMRC, and secondly, making tax digital, Mr. Speaker, which, as you know, we are rolling out for VAT-registered companies in 2019, where the report states that this, and I quote, presents an opportunity to simplify and speed up tax compliance.
Ruth George.
Thank you. Is the Secretary of State not concerned that the Office of Budget Responsibility report into welfare trends from January this year estimates that £1.5 billion of support for small businesses will be taken off them through the minimum income floor within universal credit? On the Work and Pension Select Committee, we heard that from 70% of small businesses lasting for 18 months, that will reduce to 20%, and that small businesses will be strangled at birth.
Well, what the honourable lady neglects to mention, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that small business confidence in the UK is now in positive territory for the first time in many years. We have gone to great lengths within the tax system to make sure, as I've just explained, to reduce the burden on small businesses. And when it comes to business rates, for example, we rolled out £9 billion worth of relief in the 2016 budget, and a further £2.3 billion of relief in the autumn budget of last year, and we will continue to be on the side of small businesses.
Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In West Cornwall, the constituency of St Ives, which I represent, I have a number of businesses, a significant number, who are facing extreme hardship because of business rate increases in 2017 and 2018, and this is becoming a burden that is too great for them to bear. What immediate help can the Minister make to make available to these hard-working business owners?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've just identified, the Government has done a huge amount to reduce the burden of business rates. We do recognise the important fact that these are taxes that need to be paid irrespective of whether businesses are profitable or otherwise, which is why we have gone to such lengths, £9 billion worth of relief, including transitional relief for those facing the largest potential increases in business rates in 2016, and a further £2.3 billion by way of bringing forward by 2 years the change in the indexation of business rates from RPI to CPI, saving businesses £2.3 billion over the next few years.
Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Business rates are also really hitting businesses in York, particularly in the retail sector, which is having a huge impact on our city. On the 8th of March 2017, the Chancellor promised this House a complete review of business rates, and yet we have only seen sticking plasters from the Government. So when will that review begin?
The business rates review, Mr. Speaker, I can inform the honourable lady, is being undertaken by CLG.
Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 3.
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is asking the right question. The only way to deliver a high-wage, high-skill economy of the future and to sustainably raise living standards is to raise our productivity growth rate. This requires investment by government in infrastructure, skills and R&D, and since 2010 this government has provided over £500 billion in capital investment, increased investment in skills and reduced taxes for business. But it also requires action at the level of the firm. Lower taxes provide a strong incentive for business to invest in raising their productivity. These tax reductions include the £9 billion package to reduce business rates that my honourable friend has just mentioned.
Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you. Productivity is a key element in determining our future standard of living. The current productivity gap in Yorkshire and Humber provides great opportunities for growth. However, to achieve this, significant and sustained investment is required. Will my right honourable friend commit to the excellent Northern Powerhouse project and ensure that the region gets the investment in infrastructure that it vitally needs to improve productivity?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right again, and we will only build an economy that works for everyone and every region if we succeed in narrowing the regional productivity gap. And for that reason, the Government is fully committed to the Northern Powerhouse. We've announced a funding boost of £436 million to improve transport connections within the northern city regions through the Transforming Cities Fund, with a further £840 million to be competitively allocated to the largest cities in England. This builds on the record amounts we're already investing in northern transport, more than £13 billion over this Parliament, more than any previous government.
Chris Elmore. One of the ways in which the Chancellor could improve productivity across South Wales and beyond is to invest in the Tidal Lagoon project. This will bring skills and investment to the area, as he's just given to the answer to the Honourable Lady opposite. So can I please encourage him to bring this investment forward and start delivering for the people of South Wales?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member knows, the Tidal Lagoon project is under careful consideration by the Government, and a decision will be made and announced in due course.
Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. One of the ways to increase, one of the consequences of increasing productivity is, of course, higher wage growth, which I think would make everyone feel much better. The Chancellor may be aware of the Treasury Select Committee's recent report on childcare, which also called for more childcare support for those undergoing retraining, which is another way of increasing productivity. I wonder what his thoughts on that were, and in fact his progress on talks on the National Retraining Scheme.
Well, I'm happy to tell my right honourable friend that we have had a very productive first meeting of the partnership with the CBI and the Trade Union Congress to flesh out the shape of the National Retraining Partnership. This is clearly going to be a crucial part of our investment in skills in the future. But I do take her point on childcare. We have, of course, seen the Select Committee's report, and we will respond to it in due course, Mr.
Peter Dowd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the 6th of April, the Treasury bizarrely used an emoji thumbs-up tweet celebrating the worst decade of productivity figures since 1817. I'll help the Chancellor with the arithmetic. That's 201 years ago. Now, I know the Chancellor has a newfound tigerish optimism, but isn't his department's tweet, even with his misplaced exuberance, more like self-delusion for which local government, the police, the NHS, the fire services and public services more generally are paying the price?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have a challenge in this country around productivity, and it's not a new challenge. As he well knows, for 8 years the OBR has estimated UK productivity growth, and on 8 occasions it has had to revise down the estimates that it had made. This is a long-term challenge facing this country. And rather than trading insults about what's happened in the past, I suggest that the most constructive approach would be for us to work on improving the UK's productivity performance. That means investing in infrastructure. This government's committed £500 billion of capital investment since 2010. It means addressing the skills gap. It means ensuring that capital is available to businesses. And it means addressing management challenges at the level of the firm. All of those strands need to be taken forward together if we're going to create the high-tech, high-wage economy that we all want to see in this country.
Number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Chief Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, local authorities spent £11.9 billion in 2016-17 on children's services and childcare support, and we've seen child development outcomes improve significantly since 2013.
Stacey Brabin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the number of young people subject to child protection inquiries risen by 140% in the last decade, it is deeply troubling that there will be a £2 billion funding gap by 2020 in children's services. Now, the Minister knows as well as I do that local authorities are crying out for more support. So what urgent funding can the Minister now make available to protect these vulnerable children?
Well, first of all, we've actually increased the spending for the most vulnerable by £1 billion since 2010. That is funding for the most vulnerable through local authorities. But what I'd point out to the Honourable Lady is the important thing is the outcomes we're achieving. And the fact that child development outcomes have improved since 2013, that more children are getting that good level of development, shows that we're investing our money in the right areas.
Hugh Merriman.
Speaker, there can be no greater service to children than that provided by our teachers. The Chancellor has been very generous in funding a pay rise for NHS staff outside of the NHS budgets. Could I ask the Chief Secretary what discussions have been had with the Education Department to see if the same offer can be afforded to teachers?
Well, it's very important to point out that the agreement with NHS workers and NHS unions has been in exchange for productivity improvements. So we are altering the contracts to make them more effective, to help those people in the jobs achieve more at the same time as giving those workers a pay rise. The situation in schools is different. Head teachers have much more power over what they pay individual teachers. And in fact, last year, we saw teachers get an average pay rise of 4.6%, including promotions. So head teachers do have that flexibility to make decisions about what is best for their school.
Can the Minister explain why, when we face a national epidemic of knife crime and serious youth violence affecting more and more children in this country, the Treasury failed to provide 1 penny of extra resource for the government's new serious violence strategy, which will now be funded by £40 million of cuts to an already overstretched Home Office?
Well, I point out to the Honourable Lady that real-term spending in the Home Office is going up. We are funding the Home Office, but the important thing is what we do with that money. And that is why the Home Secretary has outlined the serious violence strategy to deal with that issue.
Brereton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 5.
Minister Robert Chenry.
Mr. Speaker, in this Parliament, investment, including in infrastructure, will be at its highest sustained levels since the 1970s. And within and between our cities, large and small, are an important part of that strategy. We've recently launched the £1.7 billion Transforming Cities Fund to upgrade their infrastructure, in addition to £345 million of funding for local road projects in England.
I thank the Minister for that response and thank him for meeting with me recently. Would he agree that cities like Stoke-on-Trent are perfectly placed to benefit from investment through the Transforming Cities Fund?
Well, I quite agree. Stoke-on-Trent is exactly the kind of city that we designed the Transforming Cities Fund to benefit. And from the meeting we have, I know my honourable friend sees opportunity in Stoke Station, at Junction 15 on the M6, and to forward the proposal for a ceramics park. And with the dynamic leadership, Conservative leadership in Stoke at the moment, we look forward to receiving their application.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Speaker, I don't often get angry in this chamber, but can I ask this Minister to stop spending his time in Maidenhead and Runnymede and come to the real towns and cities of this country like Huddersfield, where we can see the deterioration of infrastructure. You just see it everywhere you look. But this is because you have cut, as this government, cut local authority spending. That's the truth. Get out more. See what this country really is like.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, the Independent Infrastructure and Projects Authority have said that by the end of this Parliament, they're going to be spending more on central government funding for infrastructure in the north than in the south. And he's speaking to the wrong minister if he thinks we don't care about the north. This son of a Liverpudlian and Mancunian, born in Wolverhampton, representing North Nottinghamshire, needs no lessons from the honourable gentleman.
I accept that Huddersfield is the most admirable place. My grandma lived there all her life, as I've told the honourable gentleman before. Splendid place, splendid woman. Indeed, that too. Chanted from a sedentary position. Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cities are important, but so too are seaside towns like Weymouth. We desperately need investment in these places, or they're just going to go to rack and ruin. I understand, having met the Minister from DCLG recently, the government is looking at these initiatives at towns and seaside towns. Can the Minister confirm this is true, and if so, what money will be available for this particular initiative?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the honourable gentleman raised an important point, and the government strategy is not limited to cities. The Transforming Cities programme is for our smaller and indeed large cities, but we're also interested in coastal towns and communities. And I recently met a number of parliamentary colleagues representing those communities, and I'd be happy to meet the honourable gentleman as well to talk about how the Treasury will be working with DCLG in the future.
Speaker, as we leave the EU, would the Minister accept that many people across the United Kingdom would want to see economic development beyond the south east of England, and particularly enterprise zones like the one in my constituency could be used in order to maximise inward investment and produce productivity and prosperity for everyone across the UK?
Well, I entirely agree with the honourable gentleman's comments. That's why we're working with mayors like the mayor in Tees Valley, who is producing his development corporation and has new powers of planning reform and so on to drive forward the economy of that part of the North East. And we're very happy to talk to other honourable members who'd like to take forward similar proposals.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Question 6 for the Chancellor, sir.
Chief Secretary.
Well, I'm pleased to tell my honourable friend that in the spring statement we allocated £1.5 billion to make sure that we are prepared for all eventualities in the European negotiations.
Mr. Peter Bone. Grateful for the Deputy Chancellor for her response. Could she say whether she'd had the opportunity to look at table 428 in the OBR report accompanying the autumn statement? It shows between 2019 and 2023, in those 4 years, sir, a Brexit dividend of £55 billion. Would the Deputy Chancellor agree with her own figures that leaving the EU would be a great economic benefit to this country?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. There is indeed money that will be released as a result of us leaving the European Union. We are working on the spending review, which will take place next year, and part of the job of that spending review will be looking at how we allocate that money domestically.
Cadbury.
Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents work in the financial sector, financial services sector specifically. Doesn't the Chancellor recognise that the closest possible alignment with the single market is the best possible outcome for this vital sector?
Well, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, made a speech recently outlining the future of financial services and making sure we get the best possible deal with the European Union. But let's remember, London is a global financial centre. It was recently rated the best in the world. And as well as getting the best deal with the EU, we also need to make sure that we can trade with the rest of the world too.
Jonathan Edwards.
It seems to me that over recent months the UK has changed its position of negotiating the final deal before transition period to now negotiating the final deal during the transition period. Isn't it the reality that the British government's negotiating position will be considerably weakened once we've left the EU?
Well, we've made huge progress in the European negotiations. We're seeing business confidence increasing, we're seeing investment increasing, and by this autumn we should have a clear framework that we've agreed with the EU so that businesses have that certainty about future investment.
Jonathan Reynolds.
The UK's economic growth in the final quarter of 2017 was the weakest of any economy in the G7. And the OBR is forecasting the UK is on course for our worst period of economic growth since the end of the Second World War. But none of these already dire forecasts, Mr. Speaker, factor in a no-deal Brexit, which would severely impact jobs, growth and tax revenues. Now, we know the Chancellor knows this and indeed has said so publicly. The question is, why aren't his colleagues listening to him?
Well, it's very important that in the negotiations with the European Union, we always keep the option of no deal on the table. Otherwise, we won't get the best possible deal. But we are very confident of achieving a good deal. And why is it that the honourable gentleman isn't welcoming the fantastic economic news we've had this morning? The lowest unemployment again since 1975, wages up by 2.8%. It seems to me there are an awful lot of eeyores on the opposition benches.
Mr. Speaker. Best one all day.
Mr. Speaker, the national living wage has increased levels of pay. In fact, we've seen the wages for the lowest fifth in terms of earnings of our population increased by 7% in real terms since 2015.
Thank you. Mercer. This honourable friend will know that the two biggest policies that have put more money into the lowest earners in this country have come from this government, namely the increase in the tax threshold and the minimum wage. What more can this government do to make sure that private businesses are working together with the public services to continue to increase wages and quality of life in cities like Plymouth?
Secretary. My honourable friend is absolutely right. We need to increase productivity. That will help drive wages. That's why we're working with employers on the National Training Scheme. That's why we're increasing our investment in areas like maths and computer science to make sure that our young people have the skills for the future so they can earn those high wages and compete with the rest of the world.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the national living wage only applies to people over the age of 25, and yet the cost of living in places like Stoke-on-Trent, there is no discount for being under 25 on your rates, on your mortgage, on your utility bills. So does the Chancellor and his ministers think it's fair that people will be expected to earn less under the age of 25 when their living costs are not affected?
Well, what I think is unfair is the fact that under the last Labour government, youth unemployment went up to 20%, and those young people are left on the scrap heap, whereas we've reduced youth unemployment by 40%. We've got more young people in work, earning the vital skills for their future.
Desmond Swain. Despite this increase in the price of labour, why is unemployment continuing to fall, particularly youth unemployment?
Well, my honourable friend is right, and the reason is because we have taken the time to reduce the deficit, to make it easier for employers to take on staff. We've reduced corporation tax, making it easier for companies to hire people. That's why we've got the lowest unemployment since 1975 and rising wages. It's just a shame that the benches opposite can't acknowledge that massive achievement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's completely unacceptable that a 17-year-old and a 25-year-old starting on the same day in the same job have an age gap of £3.63. When will she end the scandal of state-sanctioned age discrimination?
Well, I do think it is extremely worrying that those on the opposition benches would rather see young people out of work without the opportunities than in work, learning and getting the skills for their future. All of the evidence shows that if you set the rate too high, you see youth unemployment, which is exactly what happened under the previous Labour government.
Number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Financial Secretary. Mr. Speaker, there can be no doubt that this government's record on reducing corporation tax from 28% in 2010 to 19% now, and further on down to 17% in 2020, has driven growth, has kept prices down, has pushed wages up, and indeed has led to more employment. And since 2010, Mr. Speaker, we have seen now more than 3 million more people in employment. And as the Chief Secretary to the Treasury has just outlined, we have seen the lowest level of unemployment since 1975.
Jack. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Successful businesses create jobs and pay taxes. What steps is the government taking to back businesses that play by the rules?
By the rules, and I think I should make it very clear to the House that those who do not pay by the rules will be clamped down on by HMRC, and we brought in £175 billion in respect of clamping down on avoidance, evasion and non-compliance since 2010. And we have, as my right honourable friend the Chancellor has outlined, the lowest tax gap in our history at 6%. But for those who play by the rules, then they will benefit from our pro-business policies, bringing taxes down, providing relief on business rates, other measures such as the employment allowance worth £3,000 for each for the first employee as a relief on national insurance contributions.
Govern.
When it comes to employment and wages and the impact that corporation tax cuts have had, we've heard a lot of crowing so far from ministers this morning. But we all know that our economy is wildly different depending on where you live in this country. So can I ask the Minister, has he asked for a distributional analysis of the impacts that he's just been talking about.
Mr. Speaker, at great length the issue of distribution analysis in this chamber around the Finance Bill and other measures, and the honourable lady will know that all tax measures are subject to TINs, to assessments and to various assessments. We are also bound by the Equalities Act when we take decisions in respect of taxation, and as a Minister I can assure her that I take my duties in that respect extremely seriously.
Colin Clark.
Mr. Speaker, businesses in my Gordon constituency welcome the cut in corporation tax, but does my right honourable friend share my concern that businesses are being damaged in Gordon by punitive business rates and the highest income tax rates in the United Kingdom?
Well, my right honourable friend, raises an important issue, which of course is probably best listened to very carefully by some of those on the opposition benches, and I can only speak for the UK government here in this House, and that is that we will continue to be on the side of businesses, small and large, and make sure that their tax burden is as low as possible.
Brown.
Speaker, lines AG and BG in the spring 2017 budget predicted that the cuts in corporation tax would cost the Treasury over £24 billion by the year 2022. If the Treasury had that money to invest in infrastructure and construction, how many well-paid construction jobs could that money have created?
Can I just make two simple points, Mr. Speaker? The first is that clearly corporation tax cuts are to the benefit of businesses who employ people, who create wealth, who in the future generate the taxes we need to fund our vital public services. And the second point is this, that we have cut corporation tax from 28% to 19% since 2010, and what has happened to the corporate tax take is it has risen by 50%.
A moment ago the Financial Secretary was banging on about TIMS, and I was not informed about this matter, but the clerk has consulted his scholarly cranium, and he tells me that it stands for Treasury Information Management Systems?
Tax Impact Notes, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, TINs! Tax Impact Notes. Well, I'm sure everybody attending to our proceedings was perfectly well aware of what the honourable gentleman had in mind. I'm sure I was in a minority of one in not knowing. And what are those pigs I see flying in front of my very eyes? Sir Nicholas Soames.
Number 10.
Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to answer this question along with question number 15. Productivity, as I've already said, is at the very forefront of the government's agenda. That's why we established the National Productivity Investment Fund, a £31 billion package of investment in infrastructure and R&D, and we've committed to introducing a national retraining scheme, which we're developing in partnership with the CBI and the TUC to ensure that British workers have the skills they need to benefit from technology change. The focus now has to be moving forward with firm-level initiatives, Be the Business, led by Charlie Mayfield, Made Smarter, led by Jürgen Mayer, starting to look at the challenges we face at the level of the firm in this country to make sure that we're not only doing what we need to do in infrastructure, in skills, but also an investment in management at the level of the firm.
Soames.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I congratulate my right honourable friend on all the steps that he is taking with the government to improve productivity, something that is very badly needed indeed in our economy. But would he also agree with me that it's becoming increasingly difficult with a very modern, interconnected, internet-driven economy to successfully garner the information needed to truly assess how well we are doing on productivity and indeed across the whole scale of government statistics on the economy? Will you agree with me that this is actually first-order business and we need to get this matter resolved in order we may have a better picture overall?
Right honourable friend is right that there is some evidence of a measurement challenge around the productivity figures. And somebody in an exchange a few minutes ago asked about the, it was my right honourable friend, the member for New Forest, about the relationship between high wages, rising wage costs and continued economic growth and continued employment growth. The question is why the tightening labour market is not driving a higher productivity performance, and whether any element of that is in fact a management challenge. A great deal of time and energy is being spent on this issue, and indeed the last 2 quarters' figures for productivity do, on the face of it, show some improvement. Now, one swallow does not make a spring, and we should be very cautious about interpreting those, even a summer, Mr. Speaker. We should be very cautious about. You see, I'm even less ambitious. We should be very cautious about interpreting those figures, but we should expect, as we see record levels of employment in the economy, record high employment figures, we should expect that to help drive the productivity performance of the UK economy.
Mr. Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened to my right honourable friend set out the government's plans for investment in transport and infrastructure a few moments ago. Could he say to the House exactly what impact he expects those investments to have directly on productivity in the regions where those investments are occurring?
Well, we're undertaking the largest rail investment programme since Victorian times, the largest road investment programme since the 1970s, and overall the government is now investing public capital at the highest rate for 40 years. This is one of the components that drives productivity and one of the areas where we have a long-standing gap with our principal competitors, too little public infrastructure. We are closing that gap, and that will have a positive impact on productivity growth. But we still have to tackle skills, we still have to tackle capability at the level of the firm and access to capital. So it is an important strand, but it is only one strand of the productivity conundrum.
Speaker, as the Chancellor has just said, skills are absolutely crucial plank in improving the nation's productivity. Since the introduction of the apprentice levy, apprenticeships have collapsed. The government has also slashed resources for further education institutions like the excellent Bishop Auckland College in my constituency. So what is the Chancellor going to do about this middle-level skill base?
The government is highly committed to the apprenticeship programme, and I recognise that starts are down. We always expected that they would be down, but something else is happening as well. The analysis is showing that employers, now they are contributing with their own levy to apprenticeship programmes, are opting for higher level apprenticeships. So there are fewer starts than we expected, but we are seeing a much higher level of apprenticeship, more degree level apprenticeships, more apprenticeships at the higher levels. And DfE and the Treasury are looking very carefully at how this is working at the moment. Well, this is a serious issue, but the important question is making sure that the skills that the economy needs are being generated.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the only productivity figures worse than the UK's are the Chancellor's. And that isn't an insult, it's a statement of the blindingly obvious. Is he aware that in a recent TUC assessment, it indicated that, in effect, the UK economy is currently on a negative trajectory, GDP growth is weak, on an annual basis the weakest for 5 years, hours worked have declined, public investment lags significantly behind our comparators, wages remain stagnant, and inflation stubbornly high. What's his answer to this? Perhaps a tweet? Maybe a tweet with a smiley emoji this time?
Mr. Speaker, not for the first time, I don't recognise the picture of our economy painted by the opposition front bench. Today we've just seen figures telling us that we have new record high numbers of people in employment, new record low unemployment figures. That should be something that we're celebrating. Real wages are forecast to turn positive from this quarter and go on growing thereafter. Employment is expected to grow by another 500,000 by 2022. So we are working hard to ensure that productivity performance increases across the economy, because that is the only sustainable way to higher wages and higher living standards.
Order. Progress, I'm afraid, has been terribly slow today, and I would like to get through some more backbench questions, but they've got to be single-sentence inquiries and pithy replies. We haven't got time for long pre-prepared speeches. Dr. Paul Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 11.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Progress has been excellent with the Building Our Future programme. We have now secured locations for 12 of the 13 regional hubs, and negotiations are continuing on the final site.
The office in Stockton South is closing, and hundreds of staff are being offered jobs in Newcastle, which is a 3-hour round-trip minimum that people say they can't make because their family lives are built around a job that they're proud of. Would the Minister meet with me, please, in the light of what we now know about the impact that this closure will have on Teesside and its people?
Well, the honourable gentleman will know that all those staff who may be affected will have face-to-face consultations with HMRC staff a year before any changes occur. 90% of those, on average, across the programme, will be in a position of either having left employment or retired, or finding it perfectly acceptable to move to, for example, in this case, Newcastle, and I will be delighted to meet with the honourable gentleman to discuss his issue.
Well, Minister Jenrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's working across departments to help prepare businesses and working people to seize the opportunities that technology will bring. At the budget, we announced, amongst other measures, a trebling of fully qualified computer science teachers, the creation of a T-level in digital skills, and the retraining partnership that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has already spoken about.
What steps is the government taking to make sure that these skills are widely available?
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and for the changes we've done in apprenticeships, in T-levels and other matters, we're trying to roll these out as quickly as possible across the country. We commissioned the Jürgen Meyer Made Smarter review to increase the adoption of digital technology in businesses, particularly SMEs, and we'll be following up on that in the months to come.
The circular economy has the potential to create hundreds of thousands of new jobs in this country. What discussions has he had with the Secretary of State for the Environment about how we can maximise these opportunities?
The honourable lady raised an important point. We're working closely with DEFRA, and in the spring statement, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, announced a call for evidence with respect to single-use plastics, and we intend to bring forward proposals in due course.
Public sector net debt as a percentage of GDP was 85.1% at the end of February 2018, which was 0.9 percentage points higher than last February. The latest forecast shows that debt will fall this year, which is 2 years before required by the fiscal rules.
National debt's going up £5,000 a second at the moment. Can I be helpful? Will the Minister join with me in stopping hospitals who are currently outsourcing staffing in order to avoid VAT, with an estimate of 6% savings lost to the Treasury on wages?
I think the important point is that the debt is going down this year, and what we want to avoid is a situation where we were in the last 3 years of the last Labour government, when public sector net debt doubled.
Well, the honourable gentleman member for Mid Dorset and North Poole can very easily shoehorn in his own inquiry, and on this question, 14 is not dissimilar to 13. Have a go on 13, man. Well done. Michael Tomlinson.
Very kindly, is it not vital that we reduce our national debt, stop wasting taxpayers' money on debt interest repayment and spend it on our public services instead?
Well, I absolutely concur with the honourable gentleman's words. And he may like to know that between 2010 and 2017, we've spent £300 billion on debt interest, twice the current annual budget of the NHS.
I think the session wouldn't be complete without the voice of Shipley. Mr. Philip Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister, with all the talk of austerity, can the Minister tell us what the government spending was in cash terms in 2010 and what government spending is in cash terms in this financial year?
Well, what I can assure my honourable friend is that the government have taken a balanced approach to the public finances, reducing the deficit by 3/4. And what we've also done is made the tough decisions to invest as well as spend in public services, which is what the public expect of us.
Yes. Order. Topical questions. Jessica Morden.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, my principal responsibility is to ensure economic stability and the continued prosperity of the British people, and I will do so by building on the plans set out in the autumn budget and the spring statement. The government is determined to meet the important challenges we face and to seize the opportunities ahead as we create an economy fit for the future.
Jessica Morden.
The Treasury is holding on to £10 million from the Road Chef Employee Benefit Trust following a High Court dispute. Can the Minister ensure that HMRC return the money to the Trust with interest so that the 4,000 workers and former staff, including a number of my constituents, can finally receive what's owed to them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've touched on this matter earlier. I think that it's important that HMRC does deal with matters separately from ministers, but we are aware that HMRC is in discussion with the trustees in this case, and we hope for a resolution soon.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Chancellor agree that consideration should be given to making expenditures such as gym membership tax deductible in recognition of their health benefits and ultimately cost-saving benefits to the NHS?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I will take that. Perhaps I'm in need of the gym, Mr. Speaker, possibly. I will take that as an early budget representation, but my honourable friend should be aware that we already have various tax-free reliefs in respect of health in the workplace. That is check-ups, eye tests, a cycle-to-work scheme, on-site workplace gym membership, welfare counselling, and of course our soft drinks industry levy, which has seen a number of companies improve the quality health-wise of their products.
Yes. John MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In advance of the debates on Syria today, I welcome financial measures to sanction the Syrian regime. According to the past government figures, £151 million of assets belonging to leading figures in the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, have been frozen by authorities here. Since then, 261 Syrian individuals have been listed as financial sanctions targets in the UK. So can the Chancellor tell the House what is the Treasury's latest estimate of the total value of assets held in the UK by individuals connected with the Syrian regime?
Mr. Speaker, I don't have a figure for the latest valuation of those assets. Many of the assets in question will be property assets, I suspect, where the values will move from time to time. But I can assure him that the Treasury is fully engaged in the process across Whitehall of seeking to deal with unacceptable behaviours of the type we have seen in Syria, and financial sanctions will remain an important tool in our armoury, whether it's dealing with chemical attacks in Syria or indeed attacks on the streets of the UK.
John MacDonald.
And the Chancellor's response. Can I say, though, the problem is this: there's a lack of transparency in our financial system. That means it's virtually impossible for the Chancellor to know exactly how many assets linked to such regimes are owned in the UK. It's estimated that there are over £5 billion worth of assets owned by Assad and his associates held overseas. According to international reports, the UK is recouping far less from these individuals linked to the Syrian regime in corrupt assets than other countries. Assets, I give the example, assets linked to the Assad regime worth over £500 million were not just frozen but seized by the Spanish authorities. And so far, no unexplained wealth orders have been used against Syrian regime figures. The government promised to introduce a date for a register of owners of UK properties based overseas back in 2015, but 3 years later we're now told the register will not be published until 2021. Can I ask the Chancellor, will he now bring that date forward for the introduction of what is an essential defence against corruption?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman was being a little bit harsh on the unexplained wealth orders. The legislation's only been in place for a couple of months, and of course we will look at the opportunities to use it. On his challenge on the date for the registers, I will look at this as he's asked me to do so, and I'll write to him and let him know what the reason is for the date that we have set, and if there is any opportunity to bring it forward. I think we're all in the same place on this. We all want to ensure that London cannot be used as a routing for dirty money, for the ill-gotten gains of regimes that are stealing from their people and channeling money offshore. But we must recognise that London is the world's largest global financial centre. That represents some challenges for us in doing this, but we will continue this work.
Maria Caulfield.
Speaker, with high street retailers such as Toys R Us and Carpetright closing branches due to the rise in online sale, what measures are ministers taking to reduce business rates which currently penalise property-based businesses to the advantage of online retailers?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady puts her hand on what is really a significant structural challenge that we face. Retailing, this country has the highest penetration of online retailing of any major economy. We're at the cutting edge, but of course that has an impact on traditional retailing, and we have to expect that patterns of retailing will change. We have brought forward by a year the switch to 3-year business rates reviews. We've introduced a package of £9 billion of business rates relief. But this is a major structural challenge that we will have to consider over the coming years as a nation.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The European Commission has hinted that the UK may get access to the European financial services market, but only on the basis of equivalence. Does the Chancellor support the preferable basis of mutual recognition for that future arrangement, and what prospect does he see of securing that?
Yes, of course, as the right honourable gentleman will well understand, I much prefer a mutual recognition-based system. There is a problem with the EU's equivalence regime. It is arbitrary, it's unilateral, and it can be withdrawn at zero notice. Nobody can operate a multi-trillion-dollar business on the basis of such arbitrary arrangements. But we are working with the Commission and with key member states, and I am optimistic that we will reach a satisfactory solution.
Alex Chalk.
What assessment has the government made of the prospects for real wages in our country?
Well, as my honourable friend will know, we've had the good news this morning that we are now back into positive real wage territory, and as he will know from the OBR's projections at the time of the last budget, we are anticipating an increase in real wages throughout the projection period.
Paul Blomfield.
Mr. Speaker, the number of people with unmanageable payday loan debt has more than halved since the FCA introduced a total cost cap more than 3 years ago after pressure from both sides of the House. New analysis by Citizens Advice suggests that extending the cap to doorstep loan and rent-to-own markets would have the same impact on problem debt in those sectors that could save consumers up to £154 million a year. Will the Chancellor consider doing that?
I think the honourable gentleman makes a very sensible point, and the FCA is looking into this and will be coming forward with another report in May. I met with Andrew Bailey just a few weeks ago to underscore how important this issue is, and as we move forward with the construction of the single financial guidance body that will deal with some of the problem debt challenges, this will be another focus of their work as well.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Automation, machine learning and artificial intelligence have the potential to offer huge productivity gains. Can my right honourable friend tell the House what discussions he's had with colleagues across government about providing leadership in this important field, and so that we can reap the maximum productivity boost and be at the forefront of this exciting technology?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times in this House, we have two choices. We can either run away from this challenge or we can run towards it and embrace it. And in fact, if we want to maintain the living standards of our people and the status of our economy in the future, we have no choice but to embrace it, and we are doing so. I announced at autumn budget funding to support the uptake of digital technologies across government, allowing government to be an exemplar, but we are also promoting these technologies to private business, and the UK is in the forefront in many of these cutting-edge technologies.
Ellie Reeves.
The housing crisis has gone on for far too long under this government. Lewisham's Labour Council are about to build their 500th new council home since 2015, but many people still come to my surgeries because they reside in temporary accommodation. Will the Chancellor now commit to reversing the 63% cut in funding to the Council's budget so that Lewisham can get on with building more homes?
Well, first of all, we've committed that we're going to be building 300,000 homes per year over the next decade, which is vitally important to address the issue. But on local government funding, when we came into government, 80% of local government funding was being provided centrally. What we've now done is enabled local councils to raise that money, which is the right thing to do. People vote locally and they're accountable locally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Encouraging news today on wages, but what more can my right honourable friend do to help my constituents with the cost of living?
Well, there are a number of challenges that need to be overcome for the poorest, and we've increased the national living wage by 4.4% to £7.83 an hour. We've also increased the allowance before people pay tax. We've also made other changes to frozen the fuel duty to ensure that we're doing all that we can for the hardest working people in our community.
Exhort the Minister to face the House. I understand the temptation to look backwards, but one should always look at the House. Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many NHS trusts have set up subsidiary companies to take advantage of a VAT loophole to save money, often at the cost of the lowest paid staff. Does the Chancellor have any plans to close this tax loophole and place the NHS on the same VAT footing as local government?
I thank the honourable lady for her question, and it's something that I perhaps could take up with her offline, so that I fully comprehend exactly the point that she's raising in this respect.
Alex Burghardt.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. And last year, more businesses were created in the UK than in any other developed economy. Doesn't this show that the government's policy towards businesses is working? And what will the department do to build on the success?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We've seen a record number of businesses starting. We saw double the amount of investment in tech companies last year than the previous year. Britain is booming. And it's because we've taken the important measures of reforming our welfare system, making it easier to take on staff and reducing corporation tax, whereas the party opposite want to stop all that, raise taxes and make it harder for businesses to succeed.
This government's green rhetoric is nothing more than empty promises. It says it has ambition, so when will we see the Chancellor commit funding for onshore wind, solar and, importantly, the Swansea Bay tidal lagoon? The benefits of these investments would not only boost our green economy, but also supply chain and jobs.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already answered the question on the Swansea Bay lagoon. We are studying the project. All of these projects have to meet value for money tests. We already have a fantastic offshore wind sector where we're seeing record low costs to the consumer generating offshore wind. We have to decarbonise our economy in a way which also keeps electricity prices as low as possible for consumers and for businesses.
Single sentence inquiries. Vicky Ford.
Last night, Mr. Speaker, the pound hit the highest rate against the dollar since the referendum. Will the Chancellor join me in welcoming this sign of international confidence, which is so contrary to the run on the pound predicted by the Shadow Chancellor?
Speaker, I welcome all signs of international confidence, but never comment on the exchange rate of the pound.
Antoniazzi.
6 people in every 1,000 have lymphedema in the UK. What commitment will the government make to deliver a comprehensive and equitable strategy for NHS England and end the postcode lottery for lymphedema patients in the United Kingdom?
Well, that's a question for the Secretary of State for Health, but I would point out that we're putting extra funding into the health service, an extra $10 billion this year to help with nurses' pay, but also to make sure we're investing in the technologies for the future.
James Cartledge.
The Shadow Chancellor mentioned Syrian frozen assets. Of course, there's a long-running cross-party campaign to unfreeze Libyan frozen assets and see that money spent compensating the victims of Libyan-sponsored IRA terrorism. Can I ask my honourable friend to look at that again? But is he aware it requires a UN resolution? Is that the case with Syria's assets? And does he think all the members of the UN Security Council would be in favour?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he tempts me down a complex route. I will look at it again. I'm familiar with the issue from my time as Foreign Secretary. The decision that ministers have to make around the freezing of assets is a quasi-judicial decision, and it has to be made very carefully in the light of the specific facts. And there are great complexities in Libya where there are, in some cases, competing authorities claiming ownership of assets.
You're a patient fellow, Mr. Stone. You've been waiting a long time. Let's hear you. Jamie Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One way to boost the UK's productivity is to give the disabled people employment opportunities. Could the Chancellor of the Exchequer tell me what discussions he's had with the DWP and very possibly the Scottish Government to maximise the potential of our disabled people?
Well, the honourable gentleman's absolutely right that getting more disabled people into work is vitally important for our economy, but also to help with quality of life. So I'm very happy to look at what the honourable gentleman suggests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the Department for Health announced £7.8 million for building a CAMS unit in my constituency, which, of course, I was delighted about. However, the money is stuck in the Treasury, and the Humber NHS Trust are unable to withdraw the money to actually start the building work. Please, can the Minister urgently unlock this money so they can start building this desperately needed CAMS unit straight away?
Mr. Speaker, I will look at what the honourable lady has said, but I very much doubt an amount of money of that size will be stuck in the Treasury because of the NHS's delegated limits. But let me look at it and I will write to her.
In Bury, an SME business and its supply chain are still owed £4.1 million by Carillion for their work on the Royal Liverpool Hospital. Will the Chancellor agree to meet with me and them to hear their ideas about how we prevent the likes of a Carillion collapse again and protect our small employers with changes to the construction industry?
Well, the important thing in the issues with Carillion was, first of all, we made sure that public services operate, and secondly, we didn't give rewards to failure for a company that went bust. But I'm very happy to look at the specific situation he outlines and meet him.
The sentence without subordinate clauses, Mr. David Linden.
How many apprentices in the UK are paid £3.70 an hour?
Very well done. Well, it was so well done, but unfortunately the Chancellor didn't hear it. Blurt it out again, man.
Are paid £3.70 an hour?
I will write to the honourable gentleman, Mr. Speaker. I do not have the number immediately to hand.
Thank you. Mrs. Mary Glendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What message will the Chancellor be sending to the thousands of public and civil servants who will be at their march to TUCs organised on the 12th of May, asking for a fully funded, above-inflation pay rise?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government's been clear that it's abolished the cap on public sector pay, and it is for individual departments and bodies to talk to their workforces about how pay can be increased in a way that is self-funding through productivity enhancements. We've seen it being done in the NHS with the Agenda for Change deal, now with the unions and staff for voting, a very good pay deal, but one that will be supported by significant improvements in productivity. If we can do it there, we can do it across the piece.
I think one colleague who's standing has been standing a long time and hasn't asked a question. Jim Shannon.
Thank you very much. Straightforward question. In this age of online shopping, what help is available for start-up businesses focused on internet shopping?
Mr. Speaker, start-up businesses involved in online shopping are able to avail themselves of the full range of support for any start-up business. There is no specific regime around online shopping businesses.
Very well, Mr. Lloyd. If it's a sentence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An elderly couple in my constituency, Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald, are about to lose their home. They have an interest-only mortgage with Santander, who will not allow mortgages beyond the age of 75, though the Nationwide would. Though the Nationwide will allow up to 85. But will the Minister help me persuade Santander so that Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald do not lose their home in the coming weeks?
Well, clearly the lending decisions of individual banks are a matter for them, but I'll be happy to meet with the honourable gentleman to look at his case and see what's happened.
Thank you.